What if the house you just bought knew your name before you even walked through the door? In the heart of the rural South, a female mechanic stumbled upon a 100-year-old abandoned mansion listed for less than a used car. But the moment she stepped inside, strange things began to happen. Creaking floors, hidden carvings, and a sealed room no one dared to open. And when she finally unlocked it, she didn't just uncover a secret. She uncovered herself. This is the true story of a woman who bought an abandoned mansion and discovered a buried legacy that had been waiting for her all along. Stay with us because what she found inside changed everything. But before we dive in, tell us where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. Daisy Franklin had grease on her hands, dirt on her jeans, and a heart that still carried the echoes of a small town she no longer called home. For years, she'd worked under hoods and beneath trucks, fixing what others tossed aside. Her garage on the outskirts of Portland wasn't much, just 4 walls and the scent of oil and old rubber, but it was hers. Every socket wrench, every burn on her forearm, every long night was proof she'd built her life from the ground up. But when her father passed away, the only family she had left, something inside her shifted. The hum of city life started to feel more like static than rhythm. The engines didn't roar the same way. The nights felt longer, and the silence heavier. She started looking at listings late at night, not for another job or a new car to restore, but for something different. Something quieter. Somewhere that maybe, just maybe, she could start over. One night, curled up in a chair with a mug of instant coffee, and her father's old flannel wrapped around her shoulders. She found it a photo from an online property auction. The picture was grainy, almost looked like it had been scanned from a newspaper. But there it was, a mansion, half lost behind trees and vines, its porch sagging, its windows boarded, but still standing. The listing read, "Historic Southern estate, 100+ years old, needs complete renovation. Sold as is, buyer assumes all risk." She stared at it for a long time. It wasn't just the architecture, the tall columns, the sun-bleached shutters, or the grand staircase she could barely make out through the haze. It was the feeling that this house had a story, that maybe, in its silence, it had something to say, and maybe she was meant to hear it. The asking price was laughably low, almost suspiciously so, but Daisy had never shied away from broken things. In fact, that's where she thrived. And in a heartbeat, one she'd question 1,000 times in the months to come. She clicked. Place bid. "I didn't even know where Chestnut Hollow was," she'd later say. "But I knew that house was waiting for someone who didn't scare easy." Daisy Franklin didn't fully realize what she'd done until the confirmation email came through. She stared at the screen, blinking at the words. "Congratulations. You've won the bid." Her mouth went dry. A 100-year-old mansion in a place called Chestnut Hollow, population almost non-existent. She looked around her garage, at the rusted pickup waiting for repairs, the radio humming softly in the background, and whispered, "What the hell did I just do?" It was too late to turn back. Within 2 weeks, she sold off most of what she owned, the spare parts, the broken jukebox in the corner, even her father's tool chest that she had sworn she'd never part with. She kept only what she could fit into her old Ford Transit, a mattress rolled tight, a few changes of clothes, a box of tools, and a faded photo of her dad, smiling with a wrench in one hand and a cigarette in the other. The drive took 3 days. Cities melted into suburbs, then faded into farmland, and finally into forgotten roads that twisted through thick trees like veins. Her GPS glitched more than once, and when she finally rolled into Chestnut Hollow, It felt like stepping into a place where time had stalled. A single diner, one gas station, a convenience store with a handwritten "no credit" sign taped to the door. People stared as she passed, like they'd heard something, or maybe they just knew something she didn't. The mansion sat at the end of a long gravel drive choked with weeds and fallen branches. As her van bumped its way forward, the house appeared suddenly behind a curtain of overgrown oaks looming, lifeless, and watching. It was massive, 3 stories high, its paint worn to bare boards, shutters hanging by rusted hinges, and vines crawling up the columns like veins under thin skin. The roof sagged in the middle, like it had been exhaling for years. She parked, cut the engine, and just sat. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance, but the air felt too still, like even the wind was holding its breath. Daisy climbed out, her boots crunching over broken stone and dry leaves. She stood in front of the porch and tilted her head back, eyes tracing the lines of the house. "You're a wreck," she murmured aloud, "but I've fixed worse." Inside, the air smelled of rot and time. Floorboards groaned under her steps like they were warning her to turn back. She set down her bags in what had once been a grand foyer. A chandelier hung crookedly from the ceiling, its crystals dulled with decades of dust. The staircase curved like a spine up into the darkness. On the walls, old wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing wood panels beneath. That night, she unrolled her mattress in the center of the foyer, lit a lantern, and lay staring at the shadows dancing on the cracked ceiling. She didn't sleep well. The house moaned with the wind. At some point, she thought she heard footsteps upstairs, slow, deliberate ones. But every room was locked tight. She told herself it was just the creaking of old wood, the mind playing tricks in a strange place. But that didn't explain the whisper. It had come so faint. She thought she imagined it. A voice, a woman's, soft and strained from somewhere deep in the walls. She bolted upright, heart pounding, lantern gripped in her hand like a weapon. But the voice was gone. The next morning, she brushed it off. Told herself it was just nerves, just the stress. She grabbed her flashlight, her gloves, and stepped outside to survey the property in daylight. That's when she noticed it etched faintly into the wooden frame of the front door. A symbol, almost like a star, or maybe a flower. It looked hand-carved and old. There were more along the windows, some crossed lines, some loops, some patterns she couldn't place. She'd seen something like them before. Her father used to tell stories about old southern houses, how some folks carved protection marks to keep out evil or bad luck. She chuckled nervously, running her hand over one. "What were you trying to keep out?" she whispered. Or maybe the better question was, what were they trying to keep in? Later that day, she drove into town for supplies. The clerk at the hardware store barely looked up when she entered. But when she mentioned the house, the old Greystone place, as the man called it, he finally did. "You're fixing it up?" he asked, almost amused. "I am," Daisy said. "Why?" He shrugged, then muttered, "Nobody lasts long in that place." Outside, an elderly woman filling up her Buick caught her eye. "That house is cursed," she said softly. "Always has been." Daisy forced a smile. "I don't believe in curses." The woman just looked at her, then said, "You will." That night, Daisy Franklin sat on the front steps of the mansion, a mug of instant coffee warming her hands as the last streaks of daylight faded into a blanket of deep blue. The house loomed behind her like a slumbering beast, too quiet, too still. But she tried not to let it get to her. She told herself she hadn't heard that whisper last night. that the footsteps were just old wood shifting, that the carvings were nothing more than decoration remnants of a time when superstition lived in every corner of rural life. But she didn't believe herself. Not fully. Still, she wasn't the kind of woman to run from a creaky house and a few rumors. She'd faced worse than gossip and ghost stories. She finished her coffee, stood, and walked back inside her boots, echoing across the foyer's warped floorboards. The air was colder than it should have been. She double-checked the windows, all shut, but the draft seemed to seep from within the walls themselves. She set her lantern on the floor and unrolled her mattress again, but this time, she laid her father's old wrench beside her pillow. Just in case. It must have been past midnight when she heard it again. A click, faint, deliberate, like a door unlatching. She sat up instantly, heart hammering, lantern in hand. She crept towards the hallway leading to the back of the house. Every step groaned beneath her weight. Dust floated like ash in the narrow beam of light. There were 6 rooms on the main floor, most of them still sealed shut. She'd only managed to pry open the kitchen and what she guessed used to be a parlor. The others had warped doors, swollen shut from years of moisture and neglect. Except now, one was open. Barely. Just enough for the door to shift slightly in the draft. She approached slowly, her breath shallow, the silence pressing against her eardrums like a weight. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. The moment her fingers touched the rusted brass, the door creaked open an inch more as if inviting her in. Inside, the air was thick, damp. The lantern's glow flickered, casting shaky shadows across peeling wallpaper and an old upright piano in the corner. She stepped in cautiously. Cobwebs hung like lace in the corners. Heavy velvet curtains drooped from their rods, torn and brittle. The piano keys were yellowed, some chipped, some missing entirely. And in the center of the room, a long wooden table. Still set, plates, silverware, even a candle, melted into a solid puddle down its holder. It was like someone had gotten up in the middle of dinner and never returned. Daisy stared at it, chilled to the bone. There was dust on everything. Yes, but not as much as there should have been. And that's when she noticed the floor, a clear trail through the dust, from the door to the back of the room, and stopping at the wall. She followed it. The trail ended in front of an old bookshelf, warped and leaning to one side. It didn't fit the room, different wood, different style, like it had been dragged in from another part of the house. Instinct prickled the back of her neck. She set the lantern down and crouched low, running her fingers along the baseboards. And then, she saw it. A seam, thin but visible. The bookshelf wasn't against the wall, it was the wall, or rather, a door, a hidden one. Her pulse quickened. She braced her shoulder against the shelf and pushed. Nothing. She tried again, grunting this time, every muscle straining. It didn't budge. Frustrated. She scanned the surrounding frame and spotted a small knot in the wood near the top. She pressed it. Click. The latch released. The entire unit swung open a few inches, revealing blackness beyond. The smell hit her instantly. Damp earth, mold, age. She hesitated. Everything in her gut screamed for her to walk away, to close the door, to pretend she never saw it. But she didn't. She grabbed her lantern and stepped into the darkness. The passage was narrow, too narrow for anyone taller than her to stand comfortably. Dirt crunched underfoot. The walls were stone, irregular and cold. It curved slightly, then opened into a small chamber. Her breath caught. Wooden crates lined the far wall. Some were broken. Rusted tools scattered the floor. And in the center, partially buried in debris, was an old trunk. Its iron fittings were orange with rust. The lid had been left ajar. With slow, deliberate steps, Daisy approached. She knelt beside it and lifted the lid further. Inside were papers yellowed and brittle, a few black and white photographs, curled at the corners, small cloth bundles tied with twine. She reached in and picked up one of the photos, and froze. A group of people stood in front of the mansion, only younger, intact, untouched by time. In the center, a stern-looking white family in early 1900s clothing. But what made her blood run cold were the people standing behind them. Servants. All black, tired eyes, expressionless, and one man, tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp cheekbones and familiar eyes. Her eyes. She stared at him, not just because he looked like someone she'd known, but because he looked like her father. Same jawline, same narrowed gaze, same almost smirk that flickered at the corner of his mouth. Her hand trembled. "No way," she whispered. She set the photo down and rifled through the papers. Letters, receipts. One caught her eye, a birth record. Another, a property log. Then a name. Rosemary Franklin? She blinked hard. That was her grandmother's name. Another document, a ledger entry, signed by the same name. And then one final note, handwritten in looping cursive, nearly faded to illegibility. "If my blood ever returns to this house, know this: the truth is buried, but not dead. We endured. And one day, we will be seen." Daisy felt the floor sway beneath her. She clutched the letter to her chest, heart thundering. This wasn't just a creepy old house. This was hers. Daisy Franklin didn't leave the basement that night. Not right away. She sat on the cold stone floor, her lantern dimming as the flame inside struggled against the damp. The letter trembled in her hands. She kept reading the same line over and over: "If my blood ever returns to this house." It echoed in her chest like a whisper in a canyon. What were the odds that a mechanic from Portland would end up buying a mansion halfway across the country, a house abandoned for decades, only to find her own name buried in the dirt beneath it? She hadn't known much about her grandmother. Rosemary Franklin had passed when Daisy was just a little girl. The stories her father told were always brief, clouded with grief. "Your grandma was a strong woman," he used to say, "came from harder roots than we'll ever know." He never said where those roots were planted, but now she knew. They were planted here, on this land, beneath this house, buried in ledgers, in photos, in letters no one had read in 100 years. Daisy leaned back against the stone wall and stared at the trunk. Still open. The man in the photograph haunted her. His features, so similar to her father's, were etched into her mind now. Whoever he was, a great-grandfather, a cousin, a brother of her grandmother, he was part of her bloodline. Of that, she was sure. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Chestnut Hollow, the house didn't feel like a stranger. It felt like it had been waiting. The next morning, she moved differently. More slowly, more deliberately. She made herself coffee but barely touched it. Instead, she spread the letters and documents across the floor in what had once been the dining room. The light through the dusty windows turned the paper edges gold. She read each one like it was scripture. Stories of long days in the cotton fields, of brutal punishments for small mistakes, of whispers traded in the dark plans, hopes, resistance. Her grandmother's name appeared over and over again, often beside another name, Elijah. The man in the photo, Maybe. The pieces were forming a picture, not clear yet, but taking shape. That night, she returned to the parlor, the one with the dinner table still set, untouched by time. She sat at the head, facing the faded plates and silverware, and tried to imagine them, her people, eating here, serving here, surviving here. Then she looked around the room again. The carvings near the door, she saw them now with new eyes. Protection marks. Yes. But also warnings. Boundaries. Lines drawn in wood like the ones her ancestors had been forced to obey. But not forever. Something had happened in this house. Something big. Something covered up. She could feel it in her bones. So the next morning, Daisy went back to town. Not for nails or tarps or insulation, but for answers. She walked into the Chestnut Hollow Library, a squat brick building with green shutters and a crooked door. Inside, it smelled like old paper and pine cleaner. There was only one person at the desk, a white-haired woman in her 70s, reading a romance novel with a pair of glasses sliding down her nose. Daisy approached slowly. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for information about the Greystone estate." "The woman didn't even blink. You're the one who bought it." "I am." A long silence passed. Finally, the woman stood, setting her book aside. "Come with me." She led Daisy to a back room lined with shelves of brittle records and faded microfilm. "Town archives," she said. "No one's touched them in years. Might be some things you'd want to see." Daisy spent hours there. Days. Really. She pored through land records, newspaper clippings, census logs. She learned the estate had once belonged to the Whitmore family, wealthy plantation owners who vanished mysteriously in 1919. No death certificates, no obituaries, just gone. Whispers in an old editorial suggested there had been trouble at the estate. Servants leaving in the night, locals avoiding the property, rumors of screams, fires, disappearances. But nothing official, just shadows in the margins. No mention of her grandmother. No mention of Elijah. Not by name. But Daisy knew what had happened. They had risen, fought back, maybe quietly, maybe not. And then the town had done what towns like this often did, buried it. Painted over it. Boarded it up and let it rot. She stood in the library's parking lot with a folder full of photocopies and a storm in her chest. She stared back toward the road that led her home, and felt the weight of it all press down. That house wasn't a fixer-upper anymore. It was a graveyard, a battleground, a monument. It was hers. That night, back at Greystone, she didn't roll out her mattress in the foyer. She dragged it into the parlor, laid it in front of the cold fireplace, and lit a single candle. She held the old photo in her hand, the one with Elijah. Her thumb brushed his face like she was trying to connect across the space of generations. And softly, she whispered, "I see you now." The house creaked above her. Not ominously, but like it was exhaling. Like it had been holding its breath for over 100 years. The morning after her return from the library. Daisy Franklin woke with a heaviness she couldn't shake, but it wasn't fear. It was responsibility. The kind that doesn't scream, but whispers. That doesn't break you, but burdens you just enough to make you stand taller. She stood on the porch of the Greystone mansion, watching the fog lift off the grass like breath leaving the land. The air smelled of damp soil and broken promises. But today, something was different. She didn't see a broken-down house anymore. She saw a legacy. She saw purpose. That day, she opened every window in the mansion. She let light flood into corners that hadn't seen the sun in decades. She stripped back curtains filled with dust and grief. She walked room to room, notebook in hand, mapping repairs not just to restore the house, but to reveal it, every crack, every warped beam, every nail, it all told a story, and she intended to finish it. She wasn't just rebuilding this place, she was reclaiming it. Later that afternoon, while cleaning out a collapsed hallway closet, she found more evidence that the past wasn't entirely gone. Behind a pile of rotting coats, tucked inside a wooden crate, were 3 items: an iron candle holder, a child's worn leather shoe, and a folded newspaper dated 1919. The headline read, "Whitmore family leaves town, no statement given." There was no article, just a blank column where the text had been torn away. But someone had written in ink across the top, "We stayed." They didn't. She stared at that sentence for a long time. Someone, probably her grandmother, had written that, not in defiance, but in quiet victory. We stayed, despite everything. It was more than history now. It was a calling. That evening, Daisy sat at the long wooden table in the parlor, the one still set for a dinner that never happened. She cleared the plates and wiped off the dust as gently as if she were caring for someone else's memorial. She lit 3 candles, placed them in the center, and opened her notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "Greystone Restoration Project. For those who were never meant to be forgotten. For those who stayed." And beneath that, Step 1, secure the roof. Step 2, restore the front entry. Step 3, create a space for remembrance. She didn't know where the money would come from. She didn't know if anyone would help her. But she knew one thing: she wouldn't quit. Not now. Not when she finally knew the truth. Over the next week, Daisy worked from sunrise to sundown. She used every skill she had: patching, sanding, welding, sealing. She reinforced the back porch, repaired sections of the staircase, removed mold-covered wallpaper to reveal the original oak walls underneath. She sold her van for extra cash, took freelance repair jobs in town fixing heaters, jump-starting cars, anything she could get her hands on. Some people avoided her. Others watched her work in silence. A few even offered small help: a coil of rope, a borrowed ladder, a bag of groceries left on the steps. No one entered the mansion, though, not yet. But they were watching, and maybe, just maybe, beginning to understand. On the 10th night, something happened that changed everything. While scrubbing the floor of what had once been the servants' quarters, Daisy found a loose plank. She pried it up, expecting dust and rot. Instead, she found a bundle of cloth tightly wrapped, stained with age. Inside it was a journal, leather-bound, fragile, pages filled with tight, slanted writing. She opened to the first page and gasped. This is the story of what they tried to bury, by Rosemary Franklin. Her grandmother. It was her grandmother's journal. Her hands shook as she turned the pages. The entries were raw, honest, full of pain, but also pride. Rosemary wrote about the nights she spent sleeping on cold floors, the bruises she hid, the hymns she whispered when no one else was around. She wrote about Elijah, how he rallied the workers quietly, how he planned not with rage, but with resolve. She described the night the Whitmores vanished, though never in full detail, only hints. But one sentence struck Daisy like a lightning bolt. The truth lies in the room no one was allowed to enter. We called it the still room, and it holds more than memory. The still room. Daisy had never seen such a room, but she hadn't explored every corner of the mansion yet. Some doors were still stuck shut. Others had been hidden, like the passage in the parlor. She grabbed her flashlight and began searching. She started upstairs the attic, the bedrooms, closets, tapping walls, listening for hollowness, feeling for seams. Nothing. But as she passed the east hallway, she noticed a strange draft, cool air where there should have been none. It came from behind a built-in bookshelf at the end of the corridor. Her heart raced. She ran her hands along the molding, found a notch, pressed. Click. The shelf moved. Behind it, a narrow passage. She stepped inside. It led to a single, locked door, made of thick wood, reinforced, sealed not with nails but with iron rivets. Someone had wanted it shut forever. She stood there for a long moment, fingers grazing the edges, and she whispered, not to herself, but to whatever still lingered beyond the door. "I'm not here to destroy, I'm here to remember." Then she turned and walked back down the hall. She would open it, but not yet. First, she'd finish what she started. The mansion had waited a century for someone who carried the truth in her veins, and Daisy Franklin was done running from it. This was her opportunity not just to rebuild a house, but to rebuild history. In the weeks that followed, Daisy Franklin changed. Not in loud, dramatic ways, but in quiet ones, the kind you don't notice until you look in the mirror and realize your shoulders are straighter, your eyes sharper, your silence heavier with meaning. She wasn't just restoring a house anymore. She was restoring herself. Each morning began with the same ritual. She would light a candle in the parlor, sit at the head of that old wooden table, the same one once set for a dinner that never came, and open Rosemary's journal. She'd read one page, just one, enough to ground her, to remind her of the shoulders she stood on, of the stories that built the very walls she was trying to save. Then she would go to work. Every task felt different now. Sanding the stair rail. She imagined her grandmother's hand brushing over it in exhaustion after a day of labor, hammering beams into place. She saw Elijah's silhouette moving silently through the halls, pulling weeds from the overgrown garden. She whispered names she had read in the ledger: Sarah, Ruth, Daniel, Moses. They weren't ghosts. They were family. And slowly, day by day, Greystone began to breathe again. She re-roofed the west wing, alone, with blistered hands and sunburned shoulders. She repaired broken windows, restoring the glass with salvaged panes from an abandoned church nearby. She patched cracked walls with care, treating them like scar tissue, painful, yes, but proof of survival. And as the house began to heal, so did Daisy. The townsfolk, once cold and curious, started to soften too. Mr. Avery from the hardware store dropped off paint samples without being asked. The lady at the diner began sneaking her free pie for the road. One young man, Marcus, maybe 22, showed up one Saturday with a toolbox in hand and said, "I heard you're building something real. I want to help." At first, Daisy hesitated. She wasn't used to help. Her life had been built on doing things alone. But something about Marcus reminded her of herself, not the strong, defiant self. The younger version. The one who had once been scared to take up space. So she handed him a crowbar and said, "Let's rip out some rot." Soon, more came. Not many, but enough. A retired carpenter, a teenage girl who wanted to learn how to sand wood. Even the librarian showed up with a stack of old town documents and asked, "Mind if I catalog what you found?" And that's when Daisy realized something important. She had stopped building alone. The house was no longer just her burden to carry. It had become a place of connection, of reconciliation, a bridge between past and present, a lighthouse for lost stories and unfinished business. The air inside Greystone felt different now, warmer, less heavy. Sometimes she swore the house itself was beginning to trust her. At night, Daisy would sit outside on the newly restored porch, sipping tea, staring at the stars, listening, not to whispers anymore, but to the absence of them. The house wasn't warning her anymore. It was waiting, patiently, for her to open the still room. But first, she had something else to finish. One morning, as the sun cut clean lines through the cracked shutters, Daisy pulled an old box from beneath the stairs. Inside were bundles of letters, some hers, some from Rosemary, some from others she couldn't yet identify. She read them all, and then, for the first time in her life, she wrote back. She began drafting a speech. Not a formal one, just something she would read aloud one day, maybe in the parlor, maybe in the garden where the gravestones still leaned in the dirt. A speech that would honor those who had worked, suffered, and endured on that land. A eulogy for a truth that was never supposed to die, and a promise that it wouldn't. Meanwhile, the still room waited. She passed by the hidden door every day, ran her fingers across the edge of the molding, whispered, "Soon." She wanted to open it. She needed to open it. But something told her, when she did, there would be no turning back. One night, after another long day of scraping old paint and rewiring the attic lights, Daisy stood in the hallway outside the hidden door. She had her flashlight, her gloves, her breath, all steady. But she didn't move. Instead, she placed her hand on the wood and whispered, "I'm not ready yet, but I will be." Then she walked away, and for the first time in weeks, she slept. Not out of exhaustion, but out of peace. The morning Daisy Franklin finally opened the still room began like any other with quiet. Not the eerie kind that used to stalk her sleep, but a sacred kind, the kind that comes right before a storm breaks or after a prayer ends, a quiet made of breath and memory and resolve. She brewed coffee, lit the candle in the parlor, sat at the table and read the last page of Rosemary's journal. It wasn't long, just 5 lines. "If you find this house, and you carry our blood, then know it remembers you. We were never meant to vanish. We are the roots beneath it, the ones who stayed." Daisy folded the journal gently, tucked it into her bag, and stood. She had waited long enough. She walked slowly down the east hall, her boots silent on the sanded wood. Dust stirred in the shafts of light cutting through the window panes. The bookshelf at the end loomed like a gatekeeper. Her hand found the groove. Click! The passage opened. She stepped inside, flashlight in one hand, the other brushing along the wall like she was tracing the edge of a page. The hidden door waited at the end, thick and sealed. Iron rivets, heavy wood. She set down her bag, took a breath, and then, using the crowbar she'd carried since her first day in the house, the one that had once belonged to her father, she pried at the edges. It fought her. Then it gave. A deep groan echoed as the hinges cracked loose and the door slowly, painfully swung open. The still room was small, windowless, silent, but intact, completely preserved. Inside were ledgers, boxes of documents, photographs pinned to the walls. A single chair sat beneath a hanging lantern still unlit, but whole. The air smelled like cedar and age and grief. Daisy stepped forward, flashlight scanning across dozens of names, many she recognized, names from gravestones, from journals, from whispers passed down like heirlooms. Then she saw it, a long scroll of paper, yellowed with time, nailed to the far wall. Across the top, in ink that had faded but never disappeared, were the words, "The night we took back our names," and beneath it, line after line signatures. Not legal names, but real ones. The names they had chosen for themselves after the Whitmores vanished. The names no one ever recorded. The names the census never counted. And at the bottom, Rosemary Franklin, and beside it Elijah. She dropped to her knees. Not out of fear, not out of exhaustion. Out of reverence. This was the truth they had hidden not in shame, but in protection. A record of resistance, of reclamation, of a moment in time when enslaved descendants decided they would no longer live in the shadow of someone else's name. This wasn't a haunted house. It was a sanctuary, a tomb, a cathedral built from survival. Daisy spent hours cataloging everything, taking photos, transcribing names. She would digitize it later, share it with the descendants who didn't even know they were missing a piece of themselves. But before she left the room, she did one more thing. She found an empty space on the scroll and added her own name. Daisy Franklin, descendant, restorer, witness. The next week, she sent invitations. Not to tourists, to family, distant cousins, old neighbors, names she'd found in letters and online ancestry groups. Dozens of people who shared the same blood, the same questions, the same longing to know where they came from. And they came from Memphis, from Chicago, from Alabama, even from New York. Cars lined the gravel drive for the first time in nearly a century. Daisy stood on the porch in a clean work shirt, hands still calloused, but heart light. She welcomed each person with a smile and said the same words, "You made it home." Inside, the house glowed. The floors gleamed. The dining room was cleared. The walls were lined with framed photos of those who had lived and worked there, the ones who had stayed invisible for too long. And the still room. It was open. Not to everyone, only to those who came with reverence, who understood. Daisy stood in the doorway and said, "This is where they kept the truth alive. And now we carry it forward." That night, they gathered under the stars, behind the mansion, where the old graves still stood. Daisy placed candles along the worn headstones, now cleaned and marked. She read aloud from Rosemary's journal. She read the names on the scroll. And then, she spoke not as a mechanic, not even as a homeowner, but as a bridge between generations. This house tried to warn me when I got here. I thought it was haunted. I thought I was fixing broken wood. But it was never the house that was broken. It was the silence. And now, that silence is gone. A long hush followed. Then someone clapped. Another joined in. Soon, the backyard was filled with applause and soft sobs, and people hugging strangers who somehow didn't feel like strangers anymore. Later that night, Daisy sat on the porch again, tea in hand, a blanket around her shoulders. The house behind her was no longer decaying. It was alive. She looked out across the dark fields and whispered, "You stayed, Grandma. You stayed so we could find our way back." And somewhere deep inside the house, a floorboard creaked. Not in warning, not in fear, but like an old voice, finally saying, "Thank you." Anyone can reclaim a lost story if they're brave enough to face the silence, and steady enough to carry its weight. As the lantern's glow flickered behind her, Daisy Franklin stepped out onto the newly restored porch of Greystone, not to rest, but to begin something far bigger than repairs. In her hands wasn't a wrench or a journal this time, but a blueprint. A plan for turning the mansion into a center for remembrance, education, and truth. A place where buried names would be spoken again, where descendants could come and be seen. Because Daisy now understood the house wasn't just part of her history. It belonged to every voice that had been silenced, every ancestor left out of the books, every young woman told she came from nothing. The mechanic once dismissed for dreaming too big had become the restorer of generations. And for Daisy, and for all who would walk through that door after her, the past wasn't something to run from. It was a starting point. The end. Up next, 2 more unforgettable stories are waiting. Click to keep exploring with us, and hit subscribe if you believe truth, legacy, and dreams are always worth rebuilding.